Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. And today I am excited to welcome a first-time guest onto the show. My daughter, Kaidance Martino, comes on, and we're going to talk about accommodation culture and what is, quite frankly, I think something that many people will find surprising. Accommodation culture actually hurts people often more than it helps them. Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to The Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
All right, welcome back. I hope that your day is going well. Wherever your day is, I hope that it is being a great day. I hope that you are just knocking it out of the park. And if you're just surviving, that's okay too. I'm excited because today my daughter Kaidance is with me. My daughter Kaidance is a freshman at Cornerstone University, and she is, I'm going to let her tell you about her major. Kaidance, go ahead. Tell us about your major. What do you study and what do you want to do with it?
I am currently studying child and adolescent services and psychology. I'm hoping to be a child life specialist or possibly work in the school system someday. I'm not sure which one, but one of the two.
All right, awesome. That sounds really cool. How'd you come to that major?
I originally started in social work, actually, and it ended up being that I was learning about something so broad when I really just cared about children. I've been volunteering at my church with kids for years. And I just realized that those are my passion. I really want to work on enriching kids' lives. Okay, awesome. So you're here today not to talk about your schooling, but to actually talk about accommodation culture. And this whole episode idea came up because of a speech that you had to give at school and because of some experiences that you had at school. And I remember thinking that would be something that I think my listeners would appreciate listening to. And your mom's been on the show. Kendra's been on the show, and now you. Who knows? Maybe next year, Kyra. And Joey's even been on the show for a hot second. He says, "Hi, my name is Joey," in one of the episodes. So cute.
Yeah, he is cute. Okay, so one of the things that I think is interesting about this topic is I think probably some people, when they hear the words accommodation culture, they might actually think that sounds like a good thing because on the surface of it, that sounds like reasonable things like easier access for people who need wheelchair access, close-up parking for people who have disabilities. And so accommodation culture, one of the things, and for the listener, we've talked about this in previous episodes, one of the things that I think is interesting about our family is we have some broad-ranging discussions at the house. And when I heard you and your sister first having this conversation, one of the things that I thought was, man, we probably need to explain what we're talking about here to people because it's not things like wheelchair access. It's not things like ramps for those types of things or handicap parking. It's not things like making sure that there are headphones available for people, at Broadway. We like to go to Broadway. Well, you don't, but your sister and your mom and I do. Talk to me about that. What exactly are we talking about here?
So the difference would be it's more of pushing accommodation on things that don't always need it. Things like handicap ramps or handicap parking, all of those things are very necessary for very obvious reasons. For me, I actually did most of my schoolwork on the mental health accommodation because that people often put long term. So like accommodation, I've seen people with anxiety get accommodation for tests where they get longer turns and get to leave the room forever. And that actually can make the anxiety worse and it pushes out long term. Okay. All right.
So you're actually jumping a little bit ahead on me there, right? You're talking about the consequences. And of course, for podcasting, the audience can't see you, but it's funny to me how nervous you are. So what you're talking about is mental health accommodations, specifically in your paper, right? And you're calling, and that's has a broad umbrella known as accommodation culture. Mm-hmm. So certainly, as therapists, one of the most common questions that we get, that we roll our eyes at, is the hey, can you write a letter so that I can have my dog as an emotional support animal? When the person wouldn't come anywhere near meeting the clinical criteria for it. They just want that apartment, and the apartment has rules that they can't have emotional support animals, or they can't have animals unless they're emotional support animals. Or can you write a letter that my snake is my emotional support animal, and those types of things. Okay, so when you started to write this paper, and so that's, I guess, I said earlier it was a speech, and you said it was an essay. Was it both?
It was in high school. The idea of it was inspired by issues with a speech, actually, that someone I knew had.
Okay.
And then I wrote a research paper on it this past fall at college.
Okay, so not coincidentally, I have talked about that speech class on this podcast show. Long-term listeners will remember the episode where you came to me and you were like, hey, we're going to go talk to Mr. Goff, who's the principal, about allowing my classmate to sit outside of the classroom because someone's going to give a speech on how to treat ADHD, I believe without meds. Mm-hmm. And she didn't think she should have to sit in it because she wasn't able to live her best life, which is insane to me. And I know to you as well now that you've seen the light. Okay, so accommodation culture for mental health issues. And you said earlier in this episode here that you've seen students be able to get time indefinitely. Is that your beef? Because you're not really actually saying that people shouldn't ever get time. I know you too well to know that's not what you're saying. What are you saying?
I think that accommodation should be used more as a tool than it is a solution to these problems. I think that getting extra time on a test, if you're concerned about it, can be beneficial. But if you're doing it the entire time, it ends up not actually having the help that accommodation intended for it to have.
So you're saying then that the accommodation should be more of almost something like a Band-Aid, right? A Band-Aid doesn't heal us, but it does help close a wound so that the body can heal itself. And so maybe we give more time so that the student can learn more skills, more management skills, self-management skills.
Exactly. It's along that lines. For example, in my personal life, I had a lot of issues with focusing in class if I didn't have something to do with my hands.
Really?
So...
Sorry, my sarcasm. I have dad sarcasm, and it overwhelmed me there for a moment. Please go ahead.
I figured out in my senior year of high school that if I bring sticky notes or actual physical origami paper with me and make paper roses or cranes or dragons or whatever it is that I'm making, I can actually listen. And it doesn't require me to have these accommodations of having extra notes or extra time or anything like that to deal with my ADHD. I just was able to cope with it on my own with this one little thing.
So you're saying then that the idea of accommodation culture should shift to how do we move the responsibility to manage whatever we're accommodating onto the person? Do I have that right?
Yes.
That's pretty controversial in 2024.
It was very controversial when I was writing my paper on it as well. But the idea is, at the end of the day, these accommodations were put in place to help people. And the best way to help them is to teach them how to manage these things on their own, because not everything can be accommodated. You can't get accommodation in every situation in life. So if you're able to just manage these things instead, you have better tools to better function as a person.
And so, one of the things when you and I were talking about this, you made the statement, the bottom line is sometimes life's just going to be hard. That cannot be a message that is overly well received by your peers.
No, it is not. But I think often if there are people that are willing to have a debate, which is something I believe in wholeheartedly, the importance of debate in society, if they're willing to have the debate on it and actually listen, they end up coming to my side on it. I didn't even believe in this previously, as you said, until you had me read that book, which was The Coddling of the American Mind for anyone who's interested. But once you hear the side and hear actually what is explained and both the benefits and the negative effects of accommodation, you do see that it actually is just, for lack of a better term, a toughen up or get out situation. You just need to do better.
Okay, so what would you say? So like in something like in your situation, you said, hey, essentially what you said is I'm a kinetic learner, right? Which is something I rail on all the time. Our schools are not set up for kinetic learners. Our schools are set up for mostly auditory learners and something of visual learners. And so you learn to manage it yourself. But what would you say if someone was like, they use phrases like, well, I have crippling anxiety and I just can't. And that is something that I hear a lot. Well, I have crippling anxiety and you don't know. I'm glad you found something that worked for you, but don't be a hater. Don't be judgy. Don't be a boomer. There's a lot of insults. I've had experiences where we're 3 sentences into this conversation, And there's a lot of insults coming back, which is fine because insults are often born of anger, and anger is often born of that's the cover-up emotion, our secondary emotion. What do you say to people who say to you, well, I'm glad that worked for you, but...
I think that most of the time people haven't tried it. I've seen in a lot of situations with people I know from school or my personal life in general where they get this diagnosis of anxiety or ADHD or depression or whatever it is, and they end up making it part of their identity. And it's an important thing about you, don't get me wrong, but it should not be the focus of your life of, oh, I have crippling anxiety, I could never do whatever thing it is. You need to learn that it's not the entire part, it's not your entire identity. It is a small fraction of your life that can affect you, but should not stop you.
Right. It's interesting. One of the things that I think is because as a society, we tend to think in terms of all or nothing thinking. I think one of the things that can happen is as people get distressed about this idea, when you say, hey, essentially what I think you're saying is there should be an end goal of you don't need the accommodations anymore.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And you have research for that. And you said to me, hey, do you want me to share the research? Can you give me just the broad scope of the research? I don't necessarily need Young and Da Vinci wrote, 2018. It's a new year. But that type of stuff, talk about that. How'd you find the research? Because this really goes against a lot of what's just commonly accepted as this is what we do.
So I was looking it up. My school has access to a lot of different search abilities. So they have a lot of...
As hopefully all colleges do. They have large databases.
Thank you. I was trying to think of the word.
I understand.
A lot of scholarly sources. A lot of scholarly sources. And so I was looking it up. I got sources from a lot of really good colleges. I don't remember the specific ones, all of them, but I know one of them was Yale, where they took people with diagnoses of, one of them was OCD, anxiety, ADHD. I actually had a lot of them on PTSD as well. So that one was specifically going over trigger warnings as accommodations. And all of them ended up coming to the conclusion that the accommodation in the long term made it worse almost every time. Especially with familial accommodation, where it's not something that's regulated as much as it would be in a school or in a work environment. The symptoms end up getting exacerbated by all of this accommodation getting pushed on them.
And we even see this in our own family, right? My two youngest children, obviously your siblings, have speech impediments. Joey's been, diagnosed with this audio dyslexia thing. And for both of them, especially Joey as the youngest, we would finish his sentences for him. He would say words wrong, but we knew what it meant. And so we would go get what he needed or we would help him. And he can become very frustrated when you try to back him down the path and get him to say it right. But in the long run, we're setting him up for failure because he's going to have to learn how to manage that and say those things correctly. Okay, so accommodation culture, you're talking about things in familial, you're talking about things in school, you talked about finding research. The trigger warning thing's super fascinating to me because it's everywhere. Like I'm listening to a podcast right now, a true crime one about some corruption in a prison. And it starts out, it's literally a full 2 minutes of trigger warnings before we get to the content. Talk a little bit more about that, because I think there's a lot of people, especially your age, that think trigger warnings are a God-given right.
This is actually one of the ones that people get the most frustrated with me for when I'm explaining this. But the research explained something called a nocebo effect. It's the opposite of placebo, where you're given something and then you end up getting better, even if it's not actually the medication or whatever it is. The nocebo effect created anticipatory anxiety in the participants with PTSD. So even if they didn't read whatever the trigger was about, they still ended up getting anxiety and they still ended up feeling all of these negative symptoms. So the trigger warnings didn't help. And not only that, a lot of people would go on just past the trigger warning anyways and then still end up feeling these negative symptoms.
Right.
And it ends up being in the long term that fear gets almost validated even more. So you see the trigger warning and you immediately slide away. I personally had this issue with car accidents. I've had a couple issues with those in the past in my life. And for a little while, I would not talk about car accidents. I would not listen to them. I would not see them, or I would just start crying until I realized that they're a part of everyday life, unfortunately. It just happens, and you can't just shut down. So I would slowly expose myself to it, through listening to conversations that other people were having and then talking about it a little bit. And eventually now I'm not as afraid of car accidents. They're still obviously not my favorite thing in the world, but I'm not going to break down in tears and run out of the room anymore.
Right. And that's why I'm buying a tractor this summer. A little family joke there, friends. So, one of the things that I think about when I hear this is what we're really talking about here is some level of a balance, right? Because certainly we want to accommodate people at certain levels. I remember when I was a brand new teacher 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and I had a student who needed accommodation to take a test. He was dyslexic, and so reading was difficult for him. Had dyslexia. He wasn't dyslexic. I hate when I use those terms like that. It's just so ubiquitous in our language. And so he would get, and people were like, well, he shouldn't win. I remember teachers were like, well, he shouldn't be allowed to win any academic awards because his quizzes and tests are read to him. Yeah, you can't see us because I have the perfect face for podcasts, but my daughter's making an incredulous face to me. But that's accommodation, right? We're making an accommodation. And the thing of it is neither one of us are arguing that those types of accommodations shouldn't happen. And yet, at some point, he's going to have to learn how to do that test on his own time with his own reading. That's what you're saying, correct?
Mm-hmm. I actually did this at school. I signed up to be a tutor at Cornerstone, and they needed a test reader for someone with severe dyslexia, and then the version of that for math, I think it's dyscalculia or dysgraphia. It's one of the two, where she couldn't actually read the test on her own, but I didn't actually have enough time to be there for the whole time. So she had me read it out and then just circled the parts that she knew she needed to know so she could still figure it out on her own. So she was working towards not needing that accommodation anymore because she was slowly figuring out how to get those key terms and figure it out on her own.
And I think that's the thing that frustrates me the most as a father, as a counselor, is this idea that the accommodation becomes something that becomes permanent, right? And I have bad joints and bad shoulders. And one of the things that my chiropractor gave me to help my shoulder was this, I call it a reverse brawl. You put it on over your back and it pulls your shoulders back. But you're not supposed to wear it all the time because what happens is your body then becomes used to it and it would actually hurt my body, not help me. And that's really what you're talking about in this idea of accommodation culture. Yes, life is hard. Yes, people have unfair things that happen to them because fair is
a place where you pay to pet a pig.
Yes. And, we want to accommodate that for the express purpose of actually helping the person being able to cope and manage with it themselves. Is there anything that you would say this should be something that is accommodation forever?
I think depending on the physical disability, because I actually follow a lot of people with physical disabilities on social media, and I watch them talk about how they were accommodated previously and now they're not anymore. I don't necessarily believe in forever accommodation. I think that at some point...
Even for physical things?
Not always. I think obviously if you're in a wheelchair, you're always going to need wheelchair ramps.
Right.
But a lot of things are accommodated around them beyond that anyways. And those can be harmful. I've seen people talk about how they were in a wheelchair and they just felt so bad about themselves because they didn't feel like they could do anything for themselves anymore. And so they just got depressed and just felt like they were giving up until they realized that they can do things for themselves and learned to. So I think that if you do accommodation indefinitely like that, it can end up harming people in that way, even with physical accommodations. So obviously things like wheelchair ramps and like sit-down showers and all of that kind of thing can be very beneficial and necessary indefinitely. But you have to be very careful with putting in that line of, yes, this is necessary indefinitely, but this is not, and we need to be able to wean this off.
Right, and I think in our society, that creates almost immediate stress, right? Because people are going to be like, well, what if you put something on the not indefinite side that's important to me? And because it's important to me, it should be important to everyone. And then when you move away from the physical disabilities to the mental health accommodations, I just saw a video of a woman resisting arrest, assaulting a police officer because she said he couldn't arrest her because she had high high social anxiety. And he said, well, you're driving drunk or intoxicated, whatever the legal term is. And so I have to arrest you. And she assaulted him. And her argument in court is that the arrest is illegal because she should have been accommodated for her high. She wouldn't have been drinking if she didn't have high social anxiety. Yeah, it's a fascinating case. You guys can look it up. I imagine if you Google woman who arrested, because I saw it because of a news headline. But it's a fascinating case because while I think she's wrong, I do believe her argument is the logical conclusion of our current approach to how we accommodate mental health issues.
Well, and that's the thing. I understand being socially anxious. We all talk about how I'm not always the most socially aware person in our family, but I don't really...
And by not most aware, you mean not at all, correct?
Listen, I don't think all social cues are necessary sometimes, okay?
Go ahead.
Beyond the point. I used to be even worse about it. In middle school, I was one of the least socially aware and most socially anxious people I've ever really met. Like, it was horrible.
Yeah, it was a run there for a while.
It was so bad. But because I was forced to go into social situations, I've actually gone way past that. And despite my lack of social awareness sometimes, I spend a lot of time in social environments. I take speech classes. I've taken speech opportunities at my school. I lead the 1st through 3rd graders at my church, which is basically a speech every weekend. And so even with all of that previous anxiety where I was like barely a person socially at that point, I ended up working through it and becoming somebody that has the ability to do things like this or go in front of a crowd of people or 1st through 3rd graders who are some of the most judgy people I have ever met. That should be noted. It's all a mindset, to be completely honest here. And so that idea of, oh, well, I have social anxiety, so I can just be driving drunk, it's fine, is pushing that barrier of accommodation much farther than it should ever be pushed.
Right.
Because nobody should be driving drunk, obviously.
Right. And it really does come down to first of all, there's a balance, right? We want to help people in whatever way we can, but you have to be pushed to do hard things. And if there are things that are harder for you because you have social anxiety, then while I'm sorry for that, you won't actually have a full life by being able to hide from that. And there is this mantra that it's our job as parents to listen when our kids tell us who and what they are. I find that terrifying because it becomes adults who can't be challenged. Well, I have social anxiety, so I can't volunteer with kids. No, that's hogwash. And what's interesting is I didn't realize this till actually well after I was even older than you are. When I was your age, I had social anxiety. I just dealt with it the other way. Instead of hiding, I kind of just tried to bull everybody over with my charming personality, which didn't work well. It was a train wreck, and that happens, and you have to do hard things, and I had to realize that it's okay to feel the anxiety.
Because as you said earlier, the whole point is at the end of the day, you're going to just be uncomfortable, and you're going to have to be okay.
Yes.
That is life. That is the end of, that's the whole statement.
Preach it right there. Preach right. In fact, right now, we're just going to sing Amazing Grace, take up an offering, and call that a church service. Because that really is the essence of it. We have done away with the idea that we're going to have to do hard things in life.
People get uncomfortable and they get the idea of, oh, this is too hard, I don't want to do it. And then they end up psyching themselves out for it when it could have been a really, really cool opportunity.
Right.
Like, I could have said no to leading the 1st through 3rd graders and just kept on hanging out with the 1st graders in my little corner. But then I would have missed out on having one of the best experiences I've actually had working and volunteering and spending my time, because I was willing to take the leap and jump in front of all these kids. Right. And just do the hard thing.
And really, a lot of these accommodations, and now we're not talking about, again, the wheelchair. We're not talking about if you're blind. We're not talking about those types of accommodations. We're talking about accommodations for things like anxiety, depression, especially the anxiety accommodations. They really come from the idea, we just think all anxiety is bad in our society. And we've lost the idea that maybe anxiety is actually good, which I talked about in episode 257. If you're a new time listener and you want to go check that out, I'd encourage you to check that out. Episode 257, I actually posit the idea that how might our lives change if we were to embrace the possibility that anxiety is actually good for us. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like we often forget that anxiety is not always disordered. I've had a lot of people in my life almost like gatekeep anxiety of, oh, you're anxious about your test. Well, I'm anxious all the time, so you shouldn't even talk about it. Anxiety comes up naturally in everybody's lives. If you have a big job interview or a big speech or a big whatever it is coming up, you're going to be anxious more likely than not.
Yes.
It's not always this disorder, and it's definitely not always debilitating.
Yeah.
If you lean into it, you'll learn that this thing is not so scary, and then you won't be as anxious next time.
Because anxiety can actually be good for you.
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. Well, Kaidance, thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything you want to finish with?
No, I think I'm good.
All right. Well, folks, thanks so much for listening. Listen, if you've enjoyed this, please share it with your friends. I do want to let you know about something. We do have a Instagram page that we're just kicking off the ground. In fact, as we're recording this, I think there's only something like 11 posts on it. But I am Joe Martino is your place to find me in everything Instagram. Would love to interact with you there. You'll find pictures of the podcast there. You will find some pictures of my family, quotes from things I've written. You'll find shorts, those types of things. Also, if you're on TikTok, I am Joe Martino, as well as another way to find me. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.